Still see people joining us. We had fantastic interest in this webinar. We've got approximately about 120 people that registered for this webinar. I see people coming on board. For a little collaboration, if you're on board, and we're going to be using the chat pane, the messaging for questions and for communicating back answers. Give us a shout out. Tell us where you're from. Tell us what school you're from, and we'll get started here in just a minute. We do want to make this collaborative. All right, I've got about 1 minute after the hour. Let's go ahead and let's get started. So I want to offer a warm welcome to everybody that is joining us today. We appreciate you taking time out of your busy days to join this. We're really excited to talk today about new approaches for graduate enrollment management. We've assembled a fantastic panel. We've got a really great set of folks here today to talk about the experiences that they have on campuses. My name is Jeff Gibbs. I'm a senior account executive with LeadSquared. I'm going to be the host. I'm going to be the moderator today. I want to turn now over to Josh, Chris, and Mickey, allow them to introduce themselves. Mickey, why don't we start with you and we'll go from left to right, and then we can jump into the content for today's discussion.
Sure. Thanks, Jeff. Good afternoon and good morning to those spread out across the country. I'm Mickey Baines. I'm a partner at Kinnan & Company. We are a higher education strategy and technology services firm. I call myself a lifer in higher ed. This is my 24th year working in higher ed, the first half of which was spent directly in higher ed, working for several institutions. The last 12, I've been consulting with institutions. My background is in enrollment management and student success. That's where I spend most of my time. I do oversee our technology services practice at the firm. So we help schools implement, customize, integrate all the fancy buzzwords, their technology to help support their enrollment strategies.
Thank you, Mickey.
Good afternoon. My name is Christopher Connor, Assistant Dean and Chief Enrollment Officer in the School of Engineering and Applied Sciences at the University at Buffalo and the State University of New York System in SUNY. In my current role, I serve to support the full student life cycle of graduate students from recruitment all the way through to graduation, including management of our professional development program. In previous roles that I've served at the university, I have 25 years of experience in higher education, in undergraduate admissions, as well as in graduate admissions and graduate enrollment management from the institutional level, and I'm delighted to be here today.
Thank you, Chris.
Great. Always have to double check I'm unmuted. Hi, everybody. It's great to see you here. I love reading everyone where they're coming in from. My name is Josh Lefebvre, Director of MBA programs at Clarkson University, small private institution in Northern New York. We currently have 2 inches of snow on the ground, so I guess winter is here, but it's great to see you all. I've been in graduate enrollment, graduate education for almost 19 years, serving in both the SUNY system as well as small and large private institutions, Clarkson and Syracuse. A lot of my work has been in operationalizing teams that are one-stop shop, specifically in business schools. So working through the entire student life cycle, from cradle to grave, awareness to alumnus, all of those phrases I'm sure many of you know. So it's really great to be here with all of you and share our thoughts and ideas, and we can't wait to hear more of your thoughts and ideas as well. So I like the idea of collaborative. That's a big piece. Welcome.
Awesome. Thank you to you all. If you could, you want to advance the slide. We want to go through just a few housekeeping items. Today, all attendees will be muted. We will be taking questions through the chat, so feel free to submit those through chat. We are going to utilize a few polls, so we encourage you to submit your responses, and we'll be showing some of the results. And really, those are great because those are going to allow us to tailor the conversation around the feedback that you give us. We are going to have some time at the end for Q&A, and this webinar is being recorded. So if it's something you want to view at a later date or you want to share it with your colleagues, we'll be providing the information at the conclusion of this webinar. So let's talk about the agenda. So our agenda is pretty straightforward. We're going to talk about the current state of graduate enrollment management and some of the challenges that we observe. We're going to really dive into that just right off the bat, asking each one of our guests to share some of the observations that they have on campus. We then are going to dive into more of a thought leadership discussion with regards to approaching strategic graduate enrollment management and how institutions can adopt these practices and use them in recruitment of students, but then also student retention and communication, engaging students throughout the student life cycle. We really want you to be able to take away some ideas on how you can incorporate graduate strategic enrollment management practices in your institution. We're going to talk about some case studies and talk about some observations. Mickey spends a lot of time working with various campuses, so he's got observations that he wants to share in the work that he's doing on campuses and with clients across the nation. And of course, we'll save time for Q&A. So let's dive in. I think the first thing I'd like to do is I'd like to ask Josh and Chris, maybe you can start us off, and Mickey follow up. Share with us some of the observations that you have from campus, right? What I'd really like to sort of get into at the 40,000 foot view level is some of the challenges that you face today. Talk about what's going on in your graduate schools, Chris, in your department, and talk a little bit about some of those issues that you face today and you're trying to address.
Chris, did you want to go first, or? Okay. Perfect. Well, yeah. So, I mean, I think, from my perspective, and I think some of the issues that we face here, I think really seen faced in many of the other different campus, the other campuses I've worked at. And a lot of that really has to do with the resource issue, right? So of strategic planning for resource allocation for graduate. I always use the term of reactive rubber band, when enrollment has declined or there's significant issues in undergraduate spaces from traditional undergraduate institutions, the pressure of graduate and planning for graduate enrollment seems to be reactive. What about grad? How do we fill the gap of undergrad? I continue to see the issues, especially in the Northeast, of declining high school populations. So our bases are getting smaller and smaller coming through graduate education. So how do we account for that? Because obviously, as we're all driven by enrollments, without the enrollments, then you see a lot of other things happen, like restructuring and downsizing of staff. So I've definitely seen a lot of those issues in particular. Now we have a graduate school. We also had offices that do a lot of the graduate enrollment work. So the discussion around optimizing and efficiencies, and from a personnel standpoint, does it make more sense to centralize everything? Because from that overhead perspective, it's cheaper, but is it best for retention, persistence, and long-term enrollment growth? So it's always that balance of making investments, in those areas where it's in the short run, yes, it saves money, but is it a long-term strategic piece? So that would be something I would see. And I always talked a lot about, the offices in my previous institution with a restructuring, right? So it's easier to just put things together, not realize that you have to operationalize differently. You can't put graduate with, other types of activities like non-credit, they just don't make sense. But when they're smaller offices, which we all, I'm sure, can agree, that when we'll talk about this later, is that usually we have to do more with less at the graduate level. So it's easier to say, well, let's just put this with this other office because it's also short-staffed or smaller. So looking at it from different lenses other than strategic lenses, and that's really why a lot of our research work is around strategic graduate enrollment, not just from the perspective of that, but also, and we'll talk about that later, of that, making sure that our strategies are in alignment holistically, not just reactively. So I think that that's it. And then, of course, the last thing I'll say, just to save on time here, has to do with academic program planning. I think often, program planning, the need today to continue to innovate, I feel like in my 18 years, the need to innovate is faster and faster every year. How do we, the issue of being able to innovate and develop new programs in the current state of shared governance and the current state of optimizing scheduling is always very challenging. We want to have market-driven programs, but getting them at the right time and being first movers has been very challenging. And I think while it's important to have those types of structures in place, what I've seen as the challenge is that the time to actually get to that point continues to get longer and longer and longer, despite the need to be out there faster gets shorter and shorter. So I guess those are just a few thoughts. I'm sure we all have many more, but I'll turn it over to my colleague.
Thank you, Josh. I think you hit the nail on the head, is really looking at populations and the challenges that we face in terms of recruiting and retaining students. And one particular issue that I want to tee off of your academic program development idea to the employment market. I think far too often we take ideas and thoughts potentially from even the faculty side. Well, I'd like to create a new program, or I'd like to look at historical enrollment and try to bring this program back. That is not letting the employment market drive what is needed in terms of the educational output. So there is a disconnect in many cases between the new program development and actually reframing existing curriculum that is on campus. There may have been courses and course descriptions that were created maybe 20, 30, 40 years ago, and we're still selling that. I was recently presenting at this SEMACRO conference up in Toronto earlier this week, and we used the analogy of the Ford Pinto. I can put as much marketing behind a 1975 Ford Pinto to try to sell it. I can spend millions and millions of dollars, but in the end, what am I getting? I'm going to sell, maybe get a couple of people to join on, but am I ultimately going to be able to increase my interest in this particular product? So really looking at the educational experience as a product. Another dichotomy is between master's research programs versus applied employment-based terminal master's degrees. We may have 798 degrees of economics in the United States at the MS level, but they can be very different things. You may have a master's of science that's more geared towards individuals going into research, or you may have a master's of science, name the exact same degree for someone that is looking for a co-op or an internship and that actual experience to prepare them for the employment market. So I think you have to really look at it that way. And then another piece I want to look at too, and discuss a little bit more later, is the operationalization of enrollment management, graduate enrollment management, and how we are putting a lens of being able to be the best we can with scalability. Universities are all not structured the same. And I think we need to look at where our best graduate enrollment management model that we can put in may be able to support an institution's need to increase or enhance graduate enrollment management where it needs to be done. I think you really at the graduate level have to look into the weeds.
Jeff, you're muted. Sorry.
Oh, I just made the comment. I think we probably need to carve out more than 45 minutes for this webinar. That was you guys have already set the table for a pretty deep conversation. That's great. Mickey, what are your thoughts?
Well, I'll just say in trends, what I might throw out there that's slightly different, though. When we think about, Christopher, you're talking about, looking at programs and research and employability purposes. I look at program offerings and looking at what's happening in the enrollment demand for a lot of programs as well, being sure that we're up to speed on that. It takes a while to roll out a program. We can't just decide today we want to offer a new graduate level program and have it launched in the fall. And it just doesn't work that way. But understanding what the trends are, so you can't just look at a year's worth of data, and it's kind of difficult to look at enrollment data right now because we're coming out of the pandemic and that changed enrollment data. But understanding where that is as you're planning your program portfolio, so that when you're thinking about graduate enrollment as a whole, what do you need to have? How do you grow and how you balance that? We saw some enrollment increases 2 falls ago across the board in graduate programs. That didn't necessarily hold true as we're coming out of the pandemic. And so understanding what's happening and monitoring that as you're thinking about your portfolio mix would be something that I would say, thinking about trends and what's happening in graduate enrollment management. Monitoring what's happening there, looking at what programs are in demand or not. We might see a small decline this fall 22 overall for graduate programs. There might be some nuggets of programs that you have already and could invest more in. For example, computer and information science, like that ballooning. We're seeing some pretty dramatic increases in those programs in the last 2 falls, respectively. So looking at that type of data, thinking about how you invest your resources as a whole is something to think about.
One piece that Mickey just brought up that I'd like to go back to, it also has to do with faculty resources and teaching resources being able to keep pace with enrollment growth. And that is another growing pain in some cases that universities and colleges are dealing with. And how far do you push that envelope where you're then negatively potentially impacting the student experience? And that's something we're going to touch on later.
Yeah, absolutely.
And I guess sorry, Jeff, I was going to say, while we're on the topic, someone did ask a question. I was looking at it, an argument that prospective students might be looking more towards certification programs as opposed to graduate programs. Is that supported by data? I just happened to put some of the Christopher, you mentioned presenting at ACRO this week. I was presenting to a leadership class yesterday about enrollment trends. And so I just happen to have a little data up. And yeah, the question, Joseph, you asked that question about certificate programs. Those are something that's a bit more in demand right now compared to full degree programs. We're seeing that a little bit. And I think that's important to think about when you look at your portfolio and mix of offerings, not just program offerings, certificate offerings. How do you blend that together? And I would just say from the consulting side, we have several clients that are very focused right now on certificate programs in addition to graduate programs, but really more focused on the certificates.
That's fantastic. Thank you, Mickey. So Chris, you sort of opened the door a little bit about a conversation around a centralized versus a decentralized approach, right? I think it's very well documented the differences between undergraduate admissions and graduate schools and graduate departments and how they approach student recruitment and the processes and the workflows that they utilize for engaging students, right? Let's jump into a conversation. I think, Josh, you've also got some content maybe that you'd like to share, some content that you and Chris collaborate on and created that you'd like to take us through. But I'd like to get into a conversation about really a decentralized versus a centralized approach to the way that we engage students and how we engage our faculty and staff and the value of the two models.
Sure. Yeah. Well, I think to really set the stage, the first thing to really think about before we get into models is the key terms. There's terms and definitions. I think it's important for us to go through a very quick journey of when we think about strategic enrollment management, SEM. There are very specific, well-documented articles and research and really well-known authors that really lay the framework for what strategic enrollment management is and what that looks like from the perspective, of strategic and operationalizing. It's been well documented. But I think one of the things that we've learned, Chris and I, over the course of several years is there's really nothing out there for graduate education. It's nothing that's defined. There's no specific conversations, both from an academic research article context, peer reviews work all the way straight through. And things, as institutions evolve, as graduate enrollment becomes more and more of a player in many different context that it hadn't necessarily have been before. There was actually I think an iPeds article several years ago that said by 2027, I can't remember the exact year, a third of all enrollments in our country will be graduate. And as we think about our mix, as we think about as you mentioned, the key differences, I think it's important for us to have a framework around how do we, the strategic side of things before we even get into the operational. So we look quickly, at enrollment management by definition, Don Hosler here, both an organizational concept as well as systematic set of activities designed to enable educational institutions to exert more influence on their student enrollment. So we think about it's who the students choose to serve. So any kind of enrollment or any kind of structure or anything that we talk about, just remember that it's not prescriptive. Every institution is different, but what we have to think about is how could this work for the specific situation that we're in? So when you think about SEM, it's that comprehensive process to achieve and maintain the optimal recruitment and attainment of students that you choose to serve. So there's always been this conversation about how do we actually operationalize this, but from a grad perspective, it's different, right? We're admitting to program, we're not admitting to institution. We have research, we have faculty engagement, we have different types of activities and processes at the graduate level. So how do we use those concepts and think about operationalizing based on the differences between undergrad and grad. What does that look like? And hopefully after we talk through this, we'll be able to engage in these conversations, and we'd love to hear from you. So in 2014, we just, we've been talking a lot, doing a lot of case studies, and just really engaging in various focus groups and learning from people. And we tried to hypothesize, what is graduate enrollment management? And we came up with, with this comprehensive approach, the methods which we institute and retain, support, just very much a mirror of SEM, but post-baccalaureate students, including the codependent functions working congruently, meaning at the graduate level, you have the important conversations around relationship and persistence, especially as it relates to research. You have individual departments that are managing their own programs, institutions that don't necessarily have a centralized graduate school. And even with the graduate school that's centralized, the historical roots of graduate schools were more policy and research grant management driven, not necessarily the enrollment piece. But, as we've gone through time, it's great to say this is what GEM is, this is what grad is. But now we have to really define and working with, concepts with an ACRO, it kind of came out of, well, it's great to say GEM from an enrollment, operational perspective, but we need to think about what does it mean to strategically plan for graduate enrollments, looking at the market-driven programs that we're talking about, looking at our portfolio mix, and looking at things like certificates. I remember the CGS application trend survey talked about that growth in certificate programs. And what does that look like from a market-driven perspective? Does it work for people? Then you have the issue of, yes, it's great to have all these certificates, but how is, some students don't have the ability to pay. And then you have the issue of the Certificate Disclosure Act, and how does that impact our enrollment? So GSEM is something that we're really working towards and doing a national study on, and trying to really think about, one thing to think about our model and how it supports that, but does the strategy context also have that right alignment? And as we think about the declining of high school enrollments, and we think about the mix of changing of institutions having to really innovate and think differently about who they're serving, how they're serving, it's the actualization of SEM at the graduate context is what we're talking about. So if anything, we take away that, this is an example of how we've had to organically shift and grow over time. But it's a comprehensive evaluation of the programs and the disciplines as it relates to the graduate planning. But I think the important piece here, more than ever, but it needs to be also looking at the interplay between grad and undergrad enrollment and in relation to university-wide goals. So you can't look at and thinking strategically about graduate enrollment in a silo, because there are so many factors at the undergraduate level that impact what an institution does at the graduate level. Getting rid of that rubber band effect of reaction, but planning long-term, looking at data, looking at trends, looking at labor market demands, but aligning all of that with strategic planning of the overall enrollment picture, meaning the interplay between these two has to directly correlate to resource allocation, staffing levels, all of the things that we've talked about, we're going to talk about, is really that next piece as it relates to GSEM. So I'll just quickly go into on the next slide, and we have just an example of what that means. When we think about operationalizing GEM, we think about the fact that the differences kind of directed us to, when we first came up with this model, everyone was talking about the differences. It's decentralized. We're in our own departments. We have less staff. We don't have an opportunity to think about how do we improve student retention and persistence. And we don't have time to think about and do everything in a silo. So if we think about the silos of enrollment, that's traditionally been, okay, you have your admissions office, and then you have a financial aid office, and then each department may have someone that helps with different research grants and supporting, GA appointments. But what about the student experience, right? So we think about persistence. There are elements of the student experience that we want to differentiate, right? So when we think about the need to differentiate, we need to think about the need of students retaining, but also being able to do all of that work when we have less staff. So if we can move to the next slide. Are we frozen? There we go. This is, just for conversations, we think about the new normal or what graduate enrollment looks like. We have less staff, but we need to engage people, right? So how many of you have said, faculty say, well, recruitment is not my responsibility? So enrollment and recruitment is everyone's responsibility, but each institution has to take a different approach to engage stakeholders. Stakeholder engagement at the graduate level, especially with a discipline specific focus, really have to think about how do we engage them in different ways and operationalize this. So if we took the silo, right? So if you took all of these different elements of the student life cycle, the traditional silo is that handoff. And in that handoff, the relationships that we talk about being important at the graduate level really have an impact on student retention, has an impact on the ability of word of mouth and all of these other aspects that we think about. Because at the graduate level, our argument would be it's not just about admitting to a program, but it's admitting to an experience. And we have to find ways to differentiate ourselves in ways that we don't have a lot of staff to go out and do that necessarily. So the idea of a graduate office that is cross-trained, right? So you might have somebody who can go out on the road and can build relationships, but maybe their primary champion is this program, or their primary champion is the student support services. The beauty of that is then these people who are curating the experiences are also able to be part of building the content necessary to differentiate yourself on the top end of your funnel. And if you're working collectively like that, maybe you have an graduate enrollment council, right? So opportunities for you to share those cross-functional conversations and come up with a strategic plan that includes all of that. So I like to refer to this idea of student services. So you'll see these different functions in here. As a differentiating method is called the 4 O's, or the tetralogy of student services, I call it, because that continuum allows us to pull back and forth the student life cycle to impact, without more staff, without everything else that we've talked about, impact those experiences. So onboarding would be the first one. How could we get student services, the student experience, maybe workshops and all these other things? How do we pull that into the front end so that we have that opportunity to sell what we're doing? But whether it's the content, the stories of the student experience, maybe inviting students to workshops, maybe having current students in a part of that process. There's so many different things we could talk about. I'm trying to be mindful of time here, but thinking about that continuum, because we're all working collectively, we're able to impact the messages that we're sending. Now, that said, I would also say technology is a huge piece of this. We have the ability to automate and engage people in ways that we never thought we could before. You don't need all that staff that we're never going to get anyway, because we're always short-staffed, to be able to impact that experience of what I'm talking about. Now, again, that's not subjective or not prescriptive, but it's an opportunity for us to think about how do we build a model that supports growth by using technology, by engaging in the student experience on that continuum, and more. So I'll stop there, but it's really just an introduction into how organically we've shifted and become more focused on how do we operationalize in a different way. And now that we have that, let's talk about what are some strategic drivers of graduate education in the future. But I'll stop there, Jeff, but I could talk all day about this. Oh, you're muted.
Yeah, thank you. Chris, any thoughts? Mickey, any thoughts on that opening?
I think the notion of scalability is extremely important when you're looking at models to support graduate education and graduate enrollment management. I think an imperative is to do a strategic enrollment plan analysis for the campus. So in many cases, we have presidents or board of trustees saying we need to grow graduate enrollment, or we need to grow enrollment. I think it should be done collaboratively, both undergrad and grad at the same time. Our campus several years ago examined how we could grow to over 30,000 students at the University at Buffalo. And one of the ways that we were able to look at that is by having campus-wide representation on a series of committees and subcommittees where input was taken not only from staff, but faculty and students. It is full student continuum. A lot of your retention issues, your student success issues drive your recruiting. The best way of recruiting a student is being able to, through word of mouth. So in many cases, that student experience can really drive the success there. But I also cannot understate scalability. I think that that's a really important aspect to think about. In terms of how you identify what areas to grow and how it's aligned with the employment market and the global situation, because it's a global enrollment situation in terms of some of the struggles with certain countries, and we can talk more about those later.
Great. Well, there's two themes that I keep hearing that are standing out. One is the staffing, right? I think Josh, you said, or maybe it was Chris, you made the comment that there's this attitude sometimes that recruiting is not my job, when it clearly is. And then the other part is the technology. So I think these are two key components in achieving some of the objectives that we're talking about. So I'm just curious. I'd like maybe just throw it out to the group, talking about staffing. How do we facilitate involvement? What are some of the ways in which you can get faculty and staff on board, create some accountability, get them into the process? How do you bring them in so that they're bought into the objectives that you're trying to achieve as a graduate school?
I'm happy to take this one, Mickey, or if you want to jump in.
Go ahead. Yep, you go ahead.
So I think one thing in particular, as I had mentioned just previously, is having a campus-wide strategic enrollment planning exercise that the campus looks at, where there's overlap in an examination of recruiting strategies, student success strategies, of being able to do that. Another component of that, after you've identified the areas of potential growth, is looking at ways of incentivizing faculty or incentivizing staff involvement, and whether that be through assignment of targets at the programmatic level. I think that's an extremely important component at the graduate level, not just saying here, you need to grow enrollment. The problem at the graduate level versus the undergrad level, in many cases, when you're trying to grow undergrad enrollment, you're growing it for the institution. But at the graduate level, if you say grow graduate enrollment, how easy is that if you have humanities and you have arts and you have management and you have engineering? There are completely different challenges that each one of those individual programs face. And if you're sitting at the university level or the college level, or the school level, you may not have those nuances in place. So being able to look at the whole and the sum of the parts, being able to equal what your goals are, I think are extremely important. From the standpoint of being able to come up with a enrollment targets, they have to be based upon actuality, meaning looking at employment trends, the labor market trends, which drive a lot of that, as opposed to folklore or history. Yes, history is a great way of being able to analyze things. I'm a data geek. I like to look at trends and whatnot. But over time, necessarily, things change. I'll use an example in engineering. Electrical engineering was in a boom up until 2015. And then nationally, you saw programs losing 300% of enrollment on many of our master's programs in electrical because this shift went over to computer science and software. In the meantime, there was a significant amount of investment that was done in those, but that can be seen when you look at the labor market trend. You could have predicted some of that was going to occur. So having a strategic vision of being able to look at the data to drive some of your decision making in how you plan from an infrastructure way and also from an enrollment way at the graduate level can be very helpful.
I'll add a couple of things. When we think about how do we incentivize or have other folks get involved, I think understanding what your needs are and being very specific and clear about what it is we need support in to help us grow. I see time and time again faculty involvement by they attend an event to help recruit. Some faculty like that, some don't. They don't always appreciate going sitting at a table and not having one show up. And when we think about what is it that might drive someone to want to volunteer, something that in the weeds to that level, what might drive them and what is their expectation? Sometimes it's more helpful if they help create content, understanding what those needs are and how you can tie them in. Other things I would say important in terms of getting that buy-in, find the people who are already helping you build a campaign to promote what they're doing. Let them demonstrate to their colleagues across campus the benefits they receive from that effort, why they do that, so that you can start to highlight, not just say, hey, here's what we need. Here are people that are doing it and doing it well. I think that's really important. And Chris, going back to what you said at a little bit higher level, when you look at these plans and goals and knowing it at that program level, you're right. Other folks at the upper level don't understand that. They know they have an enrollment need, and that enrollment needs to be communicated down until you get to the program level. And then we begin to understand. So if I oversee multiple programs, then I need to know what my number is and how do we break that up by program so that we're not putting out some random number that oversees multiple programs and we just have to try to hit it. That doesn't work, not consistently. When you've seen it work is when there's a boon enrollment overall And so you're going to hit the number either way. But we're not in one of those right now. And when you look at what those needs are, building out that program, we did have a question that came across in the chat. Someone's asking about, are there examples of a plan? I like to look at my portfolio, look at what my enrollment is by the number of programs that I have. And then I look at a portfolio of how I drive to get to that enrollment, and then plan from there. I just kind of reverse engineer everything. And so I look at what I do to drive enrollment, the timing of all of that enrollment. I think it varies, but I would have one of that built out by program. And do it that way. And then that might feed into a larger plan. So it might be a programmatic plan, then it might be a school plan or a college level plan, and build it up. And Chris and Josh, you can talk to that too, of how you've seen it done. But again, it needs to work for your institution. There's not, for me, a single way to do it. It needs to work for you so that it's documented, you know what you need to do, and you're able to take it and execute on it. What works so that you can execute? Because regardless of what you write down, it's got to be executed. If you're putting it into a format that doesn't allow and I'm saying crystal clear about what everyone needs to do to achieve what the plan says, if it's not in that format that they can understand that and they know what their role is, it won't work. And so for me, it's got to be very applicable for your institution, what you need. Josh?
Yeah, and I would just add, real quickly, one of the things that I think is also important is making sure it's, yes, the certain faculty, and well, I just had an open house, so that's why this is kind of funny to me, is we made a comment, it's always the same people that show up to do these things, but I think one of the shifts that I've seen is, with our dean here in the School of Business, we have our meetings every month, right? And every month his conversations about faculty engagement and about the enrollment picture. So everyone has an opportunity. It's very transparent about, here is our enrollment picture. Here are our targets. Here are the things that we need to accomplish. And I think with having that conversation coming up every time, as much as everything else that you would talk about, whether it's coursework, academics, research, you name it, it's a part of the culture. And I think if you can find the right leadership to engage and to build that sense of the culture, not just that, go to this open house because it'll check off a box in your service requirement, but our success is our success. And I like the idea of creating content. The other thing I would say is, especially the use of technology, for faculty that don't necessarily want to have to continually engage in something, we can leverage technology. Just one quick example is, I have faculty that have agreed to let me send out an email on their behalf that they did approve, right? And then technology automates it. And the only time they have to engage is if that particular student decides to hit reply. Otherwise, we have all of our stakeholders as a part of our comp plan. We have current students, we have alumni, and we have faculty. And that really speaks volumes as we implement that comp plan. But again, we don't have the faculty doing it all the time, but they like that they're a part of it, and they will engage when people hit reply. I mean, out of 10 times, maybe one student will hit reply. So,
and I think, I just want to chime in. I'm sorry, Josh, to interrupt you, but there's one thing that kind of stands out to what you're saying, because it's really important, whether it's emails. And Jeff, you and I were talking about this earlier this week. Emails, sometimes I've actually had a faculty say, hey, I want to help call some prospective students. Sure. Great. What we want to be sure that we're communicating in terms of, yes, that would be great. And this particular faculty member was at the graduate level for an education program and wanted to make phone calls like at Wednesday at 2 p.m. I love it. However, the people you're calling are already teaching, and where are they at 2 p.m.?
Yeah.
So to that level. So we love that you want to be involved, but let's understand, if you want the calls to be effective, to get some benefit from you and value to do that, that's not the right time. So how do we coach that? Knowing that and being prescriptive. I think there's a term we've already used, like being prescriptive about how we will deploy that tactic, and giving that type of coaching and feedback to those folks is what's important. And so I'll pause there. But Josh, when you said that, it kind of reminded me that we had that conversation, and it is helpful to get that participation, but then also more helpful if you can help direct that participation.
Absolutely.
And Mickey raises a great point about the actual understanding your audience. I mean, if you're international and you're having it at 2 o'clock in the afternoon, it may be 2 a.m. where they are. I think that's important. And there was a question that was raised about, related to this, about conversion rates. I think ambassador programs, and to the points that Mickey was making, having the right ambassadors working as yield ambassadors throughout various aspects of the funnel can be a very effective tactic to convert enrollment. Not just thinking about yield at the point of acceptance. Yes, that's extremely important, and you should probably focus more on the investment of your money and your time on taking care and cultivating the relationship from the time of admission, but looking at things on the acceptance side of like accepted student receptions, whether they're virtual or they're in person. In person obviously is greater, depending upon the volume and your resources that you have, but even being able to have online webinars, series of online webinars, even a reception, getting people to know one another, leveraging student ambassadors heavily in that process. I know during COVID was a lifeline for us. Being able to get an international population where my university and my school of engineering in particular is 80% international. I had to use those student ambassadors as my lifeline. But then also looking at earlier in the funnel, prospect ambassadors. When they're coming up to your website to engage, getting someone like them that they can identify and connect with, I think could be a very good tactic to increase conversion on applications and enrollment.
So I want to just insert this real quick. We did create a poll, and I want to launch that poll. Actually, we just put it up, and you can see what we're asking here is for the attendees in the webinar: do you have a graduate enrollment management plan? Provide us some feedback. In order to solve the problems, you're going to have to be able to sit down and have honest conversations about where you're at and create a plan for where you want to get to. And we're going to talk about, that's one of the last points that we're going to end on, or what are the first steps into realizing that end state? How do you get there? So we're going to talk about that in a moment, but provide us some feedback. Do you have a strategic graduate enrollment plan that you're utilizing today, or are you starting down that path of beginning to put together a plan? Got about 15 responses. Give it another second. 16. All right, Vivica, if you want to publish those results, let's see what everyone is saying. Awesome. 17%, yes, I have an integrated plan. 33%, I have a siloed plan. 33%, no, I don't have one, but I want to develop one. And 17, no, I haven't had the bandwidth to create one. So it's a very pretty evenly distributed in many respects set of answers that we have here. One of the things that I would like to talk about in the remaining time is the technology aspects. Right, there's a lot of noise out there. There's a lot of software vendors, a lot of companies, a lot to consider. So Mickey, maybe you can lead us off in talking about how do institutions, how do graduate schools cut through the noise? How do they identify their real requirements, the set of requirements that they have that are going to move the needle on the objectives as a graduate school for enrollment or engaging students?
That's a loaded question, and we have a limited amount of time. So let's see if we can cover this quickly and condense. Dream big and iterate small. So depending on where you are in the spectrum of using technology, when I look at technology and I look at what you need to do, I can listen to folks say, "Hey, these are my requirements." List them all down, and I like to use an academic model because it helps everybody get on the same to put us on the same page. So if I listen to your requirements, what you might be describing to me is an engagement plan that requires a CRM at a 300 level, so CRM 301. That's what you're describing of what you need. And I look at where you are in terms of your readiness, and I might say, well, you're CRM 101 ready. And when we think about higher education, there's a reason we don't put first-year students in Calculus 301 because they're not ready for that. So if I take that client and go deliver CRM 301, you're not going to use it and you're going to fail. You'll use 10% of it, 15% of it. You won't adopt it. It'll be frustrating for everyone. Whereas if I can give you 301 and a roadmap to get you to 301, you have a much better path to adopt it well, succeed. Now, there's a catch to that because when you adopt that, you may not be using all of those features that you want. And, one of the questions that we got in there, Ben was asking, and Chris started to answer there, what do you do to create higher conversion rates? Well, one of the tactics that you need to have is be able to take your populations and put them into segments and segment your segments. The more relevant and the more timely that communication and engagement effort is, the more likely it will connect to that prospective student and attract her or him to your program to want to know more. But if you can't do that, then you're going to find a very challenging time to increase conversion rates, because people will opt out, they'll tune you out. But in order to do that, you have to scale that. You can't go from just communicating to everybody in drip campaigns to having segments of segments. You have to dream big and iterate small. So how do you start thinking about your population in terms of segments? It might be geography, it might be a particular type of program, it might be age group, it might be where they're employed. Ways that you're segmenting that audience, so that if you've got a webinar and I want to attract Josh and Chris to attend my webinar, how do I communicate to them differently based on who they are and their differences to make it more relevant, so that Chris attends because of the importance to him, or Josh attends to the importance to him? And even more importantly, I might even say, you know what, I'm not inviting Josh because this is an event specifically designed to talk about a specific topic that does not impact Josh. It might be a webinar on how to use tuition assistance from an employer. Josh is saying he works at an employer that doesn't offer that, or he's unemployed, or he's currently enrolled as an undergraduate. I don't want to spend my communicating to Josh, because that's not relevant. He's going to ignore it. And the more likely, the more times he ignores my content, the more likely it is to ignore all of it. And so knowing that, but I can't communicate to Chris to invite him to that if I don't know that level of information. So you have to build there and scale there. That's how you start to use technology. And I'll hand it off. Just one more comment I'll say. We talked earlier, Josh, you mentioned handoffs. You know, this is where technology really comes into play. It becomes critical, because it's not a single person that's going to help a student get through the entire enrollment process. They're a team of people, and it could be a team of 2, it could be a team of 20. But knowing how to orchestrate that handoff when the time's right and fluidly, so that the student doesn't necessarily understand that a handoff has occurred, is important. Technology allows that. You can't do that well without technology today. And if you don't have technology that does it, you are behind. The further behind you get, the more painful it is, and the longer it will take for you to catch up. And so that's really important. So mapping those processes out, mapping how the handoff occurs, mapping out how you want to communicate and when you need to communicate to prospects is really important, so that then you can put that into your technology. So I'll pause there.
I just have 2 things to share here. I mean, I definitely love that, because I actually, at my previous institution, one of the ones I will not name, we had that kind of implementation. We all went to the training for a CRM company, and we're, 5 days of intensive. This is how you do this. This is how you do that. We're like, oh my God, overwhelmed, so much going on. And this particular CRM is also not necessarily easy to, unless you have some technical background, and you're like, but we all get back, and we were the wrong audience to go there. We didn't have time to do anything, right? So I can remember just thinking about knowing how we could create this conflow, how we could do all of these different things, but we just couldn't. So I completely agree. I think finding ways to start small and be iterative, and small wins, I think, is something that we have to be okay with. It's great to come in with this grand idea, but let's just start with a couple of emails for a couple of different groups of people, and you can always build from there. Because there's always the issue, well, who's going to do all this? And I struggled with that still today. Like, this sounds like a great idea, but I don't have time to do that. I've got 100 advising appointments coming up, and this and that. So one thing I would share that I love that the technology does, and we're implementing more and more here at the institution, and there are other firms that help you get leads that they use somewhat of a similar method, is we have a thing called the Love of Clarkson score. And what we do is we actually build and integrate in the ways that these students interact with us on our website, on our emails, all of the different things that can automatically be pinged and grabbed. We give value to those things, and then our system creates an overall score, and we start to segment our prospect and inquiry pool, so that, yes, we have limited resources. So let's have a communication plan that helps address the cold leads. And then let's identify ways to automate and spend more time with those that have a higher score. They spent more time on our website. They attended a webinar, or they clicked on our email, all of those things. And we have this, and the system is allowing us to automate that, so that we're spending the time differently on these different groups. And as people move in and their scores go up, then we're spending more time on that. So that little system that we've developed has really, and automated has really been helpful with our short staffing in terms of prioritizing.
So we're publishing the results.
Yep. I
looking
just
at
wanted,
Yep.
I'm
Go
sorry, Jim,
ahead.
I was going to say, as we kind of look at these results, one of the things that that stand out to me, Josh, when you start talking about all of those things that you're trying to do or that you have to do in order to be successful, and it's, if I'd have thought of it, I would have said, let's do this as a poll question. But how many people on this call have that level of detail of what they need to be doing today in their job description? Like I find that there's very often a gap of what we really need you all to understand of what to do and execute on versus what they're saying in the job description that they are asking you to do. There's a gap. And what we need to start doing is start closing that gap and start teaching these types of things so that you can execute them with your technology. A lot of the technology can do a lot of the things, but understanding how to build that gap or close that gap rather between the strategy and the technology so that you're operating in a very effective way. There's a gap there, and not everyone understands all of those components, and finding ways to fill that knowledge is really important.
And I would have to believe that identifying that gap happens in the planning phases, right? So we talked a little bit a minute ago about who has a graduate enrollment management plan. I think getting people to the table and having a conversation about where the gaps exist and what the way forward is really important, right? And that's kind of where I want to bring the conversation to a conclusion. We've just got a few minutes left. So I'd really like maybe, Chris, you lead us off around some thoughts and ideas for the folks that don't have a plan or maybe they're in early stages of a plan. How do you get folks to the table? How do you do that gap analysis? And I know this is a big topic and we've only got a few minutes left, but just some key practices maybe that you've observed that worked well for those conversations.
I think Mickey and Josh just hit the nail on the head about looking at technology and supporting process. So the number one thing you have to think of is business processes, policies, and procedural redesign. That is the foundation for what you're trying to establish for your enrollment plan. So liken it to a bucket. BPR is a bucket of water. If you have holes in that bucket of water, you're going to lose enrollments based upon mundane things such as bad process, poor communication, bad CRM, things that are within your control. Of course, you're also going to lose enrollment that are things outside of your control. So the first thing that I would recommend is done is an enrollment management SWOT analysis. Look at analyzing your strengths, your weaknesses, your opportunities, and your threats. Obviously, some of those things are internal and some of those things are external, but it is important to also look at your own internal data and being able to better understand how you're measuring success. And that can also look at your own processes. Where are you having issues in your funnel? Are you savvy enough to understand where certain things are problematic, and can you go back and overcorrect them to ensure that they're not happening? I think in our establishment of our strategic graduate enrollment management plan in our School of Engineering and Applied Sciences, we did the SWOT analysis. We looked at that after the campus committees analyzed everything and really started to build the foundation of what our model was and our infrastructure was on correcting BPR first, the CRM issue, analyzing our data, where our markets were, and making sure that we were attracting, focusing the right attention on those particulars, and then also segmenting your populations. Diversity, equity, and inclusion, the diversity of my class. Do I want more females? Am I doing enough deliberate marketing and outreach to females? Am I doing enough deliberate outreach to international students in particular markets and regions of those countries? So I think you have to start with BPR and you go as the foundation for your strategic graduate enrollment plan to help create a SWOT analysis and help inform decisions in your school.
That's great. Josh or Mickey, any brief thoughts?
Well, seeing the time, I think I'll just echo quickly, what Chris says is having those conversations and thinking about process. I loved all those ideas. I think it's important to have, common communications, with each other. I would just reiterate and add the enrollment management counselor or grad council or something where you're coming together and people can hear what's happening in different aspects of the graduate experience, because that's how plans can processes can improve, and that's how plans can improve, is if you're having that constant communication and not just doing things in silos, especially if you are trying to operationalize, in the ways that we've talked about in an integrated model. So yeah, I mean, I think I won't add anything else there other than that, because I see the time, and I'm sure there's a few other things that we want to mention or give folks time to ask questions. So
I'll just go back in time and share what I did to get started when I didn't have a plan. I started by getting goals, and I shifted by setting goals, so that when others were trying to give me a goal, I had data behind it that said, that's not the right goal. I actually might increase that goal, or I might reduce that goal, and here's why, and started collecting that data and had those goals in place. And then from there, I went to start writing down, because we needed to document and explicitly communicate what it was we needed to do for our team to achieve those numbers. And that's really how the plan process started. It had not been done for us, other than a few paragraphs with a number behind it. But how we were going to do it was really important for us, and that's what we did. And then I carried that plan, and I carried all the metrics associated with that plan with me. If I didn't have it memorized, I carried a binder with me, so that in any meeting, if anyone asked me a question, anything to do with our programs that I saw, I had that answer. We were a stepchild. I was, our program was small, and we were kind of overlooked so often. And so maybe we were a little defensive about it, but I carried that and demonstrated for anyone, so they knew at any point in time, if we're doing well, and if we're not, they knew it. And if we weren't, I always said, this is what we're doing in place. This is where we're not, and this is what we're doing throughout the year. And there was, the president couldn't ask me a question that I couldn't answer when the time came. And so that built the trust, so that when I wanted to change a goal, or when I wanted to ask for more money for something, I got it, because I had everything around why and what I was doing, so that they could explicitly see that.
That's fantastic. We've got about 4 minutes left. We don't have any questions. If anybody would like to submit a question through the Q&A pane, that's fantastic, or through the chat, we can address those now. We'll wait just a minute to see if any questions come through. This has been a really great conversation. I think we could have kept going on a bunch of different topics.
While we wait for that, I'll just throw one other tip out there, what I'll say, Jeff, because when I started doing my plan, I didn't have a system that was going to give me all of that data in a way. So I had to take it and spend a lot of time building charts and graphs. But we have tools now. Your technology a lot of times will do that, or at least pull some of those numbers for you. A lot of them will allow you to set up feeds of those data that go to other people that may not necessarily be logging into the technology all the time, so that you can share your progress with those that need to know, and not, hey, here's a standard report we share with everybody. Here's the report that's for the executive team. Here's a report that's for the directors. Here's a report that's for the end users or their frontline staff, so that they know where they are in their progress, and having that so that they see that routinely. And you're not handing it out at a meeting for the first time to see. They know what's happening, so you can jump right into the conversation about it during your meetings. So that's something to think about with your technology if you're not already doing that.
That's fantastic. Thank you. Well, we haven't had any questions come into the Q&A pane, so I think we will go ahead and conclude this session. I do want to thank the panelists. You guys were amazing. That was a really great conversation. I do want to thank the attendees. We had a very high retention rate, so I think that's indicative of a good conversation. And LeadSquared wants to thank you. LeadSquared is a CRM company. We've put this together as a thought leadership piece. I hope that you've enjoyed it. Hope you pulled away some information that you can take back to your campus and that you can utilize. And we hope to hear from you soon. But thank you again for your time. We do appreciate it. I hope everybody has a great day.